Well, hello, folks. This is Keith Weber, the GIS Director at Idaho State University, and I'd like to welcome you to another one of our Tech Talks with the GIS Trek. Today, we have Wilma Robertson back with us, and she's going to be presenting Your Data Not Complete Without Metadata. That is always a tongue twister for me, especially if you might end up saying that about 100 times today in the presentation. So thank you once again, Wilma, for doing this for the GIS community in Idaho. And with that, I will hand the floor over to you.
All right. Well, thank you, Keith. Also want to thank Sydney Lewis, Pam Bond, Jen Cunningham, and Mike Woodford, different people that are part of the subcommittee of the IGC-EC. Our goal is to try and help GIS data more accessible and improve the quality of GIS data. And one of the items that is important is the metadata that goes with it. So I'll go ahead and turn my my camera off and focus on my presentation. So your data not complete without metadata. We were brainstorming about different titles for this presentation, and the one we came up with first, we didn't really think was PC enough for the poster. Metadata, the anus of GIS. It stinks, but you can't live without it. But we decided not to go with that. Anyway, all right, so let's get started here. For my sister-in-law's wedding, what we did is we gave her 20 different cans with stuff in it. So we bought dog food, cat food, people food, and then we took all the labels off and we gave it to them. And obviously, it was funny. We had a good time, but it wasn't very helpful because they could not tell at all whether the contents of a can was dog food, cat food, something they could eat, or something that they could not eat. And so metadata is similar. It's the label on your data that people can read to see if your data is what they're looking for and if they can consume that data or if it is indeed cat food. So the purpose of metadata for a GIS dataset, it will describe the purpose, it will give a summary, a description, it will tell you who created it, the time period, the scale that it is intended to be looked at, and how the data was created. So for example, when you look at this picture here, you need to know if perhaps your data set was captured maybe before a flood happened and the course of a river changed, or after. So if right now it is after, but your data set is prior, you can look that up by looking at the metadata. But if you don't look at that information is not there, then you might just grab a data set that just has the river going on the wrong side of your home. I mean, this is an extreme example, but you want to make sure that the data is the data that you want. So metadata is important for anybody who is using your data set. And this, of course, is especially true the more people that you publish your data to. So if you put it on your website, if you share it through open data, that data should really have good metadata with it. If this is just an intermediate data set, when you're just doing a GIS process, perhaps are probably not as important. But for those publication data sets, it definitely is important. So people can look at it to see if this is the data set that they need, to see if there's any access restrictions that they need to be aware of. For example, maybe it's just for only their internal use. Or quite often, yes, they can put it on a public map, but the authoritative source would like to be acknowledged with that. And also to gauge the quality of your data set. So for example, a data set from the CDC is probably a whole lot more accurate than maybe somebody in the public who put some numbers together and it's published by John Doe. But also for you as the author, especially if you're one of those people that have to revisit the same project over and over again, or you get distracted by a different project and then you go back to your original project and you have to sort of figure out where you left off and where you're at. So even it can be very useful for yourself, especially if it includes like processing steps and the source data that you used in your project. I did a survey quite a while back. I mean, I'm talking 12 years ago or and I'm not that big a fan of metadata, but I'm talking about it anyway because it is important. Using a standard is important as well. So really what you're doing is you are looking at all your notes and information that you have, and you can just picture a stack of papers, some yellow sticky notes here and there, and you just put that together in just one document. If you put this in a standard, then people know where to look for different pieces of information. So not surprising, the title is right along the top, but let's say that they would like to find out, you know, they're looking at the attribute table, there's a heading there, it's a couple of cryptic letters, MCRP, and they're, what does that mean? And maybe there's some numbers in there, like 1, 3, 5, 7, and they're wondering what that means. If your metadata is in a standard, those people that are looking at your metadata will know exactly where to go really quickly, where they can find that specific piece of information. And by now, you are pretty much guided into using a metadata standard when you're using a metadata editor. So this being part of a 3-part series, part 1 of 3, next time, the next meeting, Sydney Lewis and Keith Weber will actually show you how to edit metadata and put it together, and using those standard methods, it will end up in a standard. Most common is the FGDC standard. FGDC stands for the Federal Geographic Data Committee. ISO has a standard as well. So pick one of those. So for you as an author, using a standard and using an editor that gets the data in a standard, make sure that your metadata is complete. You're not missing any little bits and pieces. And then again, as I mentioned, for the readers, it's in a predictable format so that people can find what they're looking for. So let me just go through the main steps. And perhaps this might also be a good time to talk a little bit about metadata in Esri products. So when you enter metadata into like ArcMap or ArcPro, they sort of seem like you're putting it in a specific standard, but really the way that Esri is storing it is in their own proprietary standard. Sort of, you can think of it as like a bottom layer, and then put like a filter or a lens on top of it, and they can change that lens or filter to look at the same sort of data in this proprietary Esri standard to either look as just an item description or have it look as an ISO standard or the FGDC standard. All different standards have basic categories, so all of them have the identification information. And this is important to really think about a good title. It's the first thing that people see. And so, for example, a title as Floods might not be as helpful as a title Floods in 1982 in Eastern Idaho. It just gives them more information. So do think a little bit about your title and make it as informative but also as concise as possible. The next is just the description. Keywords are really important, and since I taught this lecture first also years ago, and now talking about metadata, the key tags are keys or tags are just a little bit more common. For example, if you want to publish something in ArcGIS online, you cannot even get away with not putting in any tags. But tags are great because people use it to search for your data. And for example, other organizations that you're sharing data through, be it inside Idaho, be it open data, use those tags as well to help people find your content and point them towards the right content that they're looking for. who originated the data set? People need to know that. I mean, are you the authoritative source of this data, or are you republishing somebody else's data? So, for example, I'd like to pick on the county layer. The tax commission is the authoritative source. If somebody else is publishing it, you don't know if it is recent, if it is accurate. It's not the authoritative source. So it's important to put that in there, that you're the one publishing it, and hopefully you are either the authoritative source or you have a good reputation, so people know that your data is trustworthy. The publication date, I know it says date, just to gauge if this is a new data set or a historic data set. And then any use constraints, if they can share this data further with the public, if they perhaps need to acknowledge you, or if they have to contact you to ask for permissions. So next we'll go up to the data quality, a description of how the data is generated. If you performed any quality control or quality assurance on it, for example, did you run a topology check on it? Not to mix that up with topography, but a topology check, you know, to make sure that information like for example, two polygons are not overlapping. Think of it as, you know, all the counties not overlapping with themselves, but all of them put together need to coincide with the state boundary. Rules like that. Or perhaps if you have a data set with stoplights and roads, the stoplights need to actually match with the road. They cannot just be floating out there. So what kind of checks have been done? Did they go in and check the attribute information to make sure there was no nonsense in there, that the numbers make sense? There's a field with an H. Is anybody a negative number? So what kind of checks have been done to ensure? Was the data complete? Is this an ongoing data set where you're still building it? Like I said, gaps and overlaps. The spatial data organization will tell you whether this data is a point, a line, or a polygon. So any of those three types of vector data set, if it's a raster, what type of raster? If it's a raster, what the cell size is, or like how big those little pixels are. This is typically the easy part of metadata. Assuming your data set does have a spatial projection with it, which it should, typically those tools that you're using to write metadata will see that, recognize it, and just automatically populate that for you. The spatial reference, what coordinate system did you use? Again, hopefully your data actually comes with a projection file or the coordinate system information built into the data set. But, you know, sometimes it's not there, and it's up to the user themselves to assign a coordinate system to this data, and they need to be able to look that up in the metadata. This is another example where if you're using the Esri tools and it does have a projection, like the spatial coordination information associated with it, it will just automatically pick that up. Entities and attributes. When I look at metadata, I typically look at the title, the description, and quite often the attributes. So, for example, here we are looking at different earthquakes in Idaho, and no, the latest ones are not on here yet. But it tells you for all the different fields in the attribute table what it means, where this data is coming from. So, for example, well, the depth and the magnitude make sense to me. Honestly, by now I forgot what MMI stands for. So it would be great if I could look that up in the metadata and know what that means. And especially if you're using categories where the number 1 has a meaning and number 2 has a meaning. Not as a number, but let's say 1 corresponds to grass or 2 corresponds to pasture, like if it's different categories like that. The distribution information. So finding out like who is distributing this information, what type of format it is available, and more data is now shared through open data which is actually super cool because it sort of gives you different options on how to download the data. So a geodatabase, a KML file, a shape file, you can choose what that is. And finally, the metadata reference. So metadata, the reference is really the data about the data about the data. So the data about the data is the metadata. And so the data about the metadata is the data about the data about the data. And if I got paid $1 for every time I said data, I just made a couple of bucks there. So it will tell you what metadata standard was used. It also tells you who wrote the metadata. And this is important. So if you're reading the metadata and you still have any questions, or perhaps if they forgot to include certain items in the metadata, I have received calls about that, the lack of metadata. You know who to contact to maybe get some more information about this data set, or just to ask them when the next version is going to be available, or any sort of questions you may still have after looking through the metadata and looking at the data set itself. So I have put together just very short video that quickly shows you how to look up metadata in ArcMap, ArcPro, and ArcGIS online. So let me start that video here. And I am going to narrate it as this video shows. So first we'll take a look at metadata in ArcMap, where there are two ways to look at the data. First, right-click on it in the table of content, and it will show up. So scrolling down, you can see several metadata items, but it is pretty limited. If you go to Customize, ArcMap Options, and then click on the Metadata tab, you can choose different ways to filter and view this data. So let's do the FGDC one. Now, when we open up the same metadata again by right-clicking on the item in the catalog pane, you can see that all the headings for the FGD standard are there, even though they're not completed. The second way to view the metadata is to right-click on the layer in the content pane and then go to Data, View Item Description. So next, let's take a look in ArcPro. Right-click on an item in the catalog pane and then click on View Metadata. Or you can right-click, back to the map, right-click on the layer in the table of contents, and then click on View Metadata. So finally, let's look at a layer, a map, and an app in ArcGIS Online. So here I am in a map, and I click on the blue dots for more options, and you can see that this one still needs a little bit more information. If you are the author of the layer, you can click on more information and even click on the metadata button to add more complete metadata. This is a web app that was created by the Department of Water Resources. When you click on the little dots for each one of those layers, you can click on view more information and sort of find out more information. So this is my little plea to please write metadata. It is not very exciting, perhaps, but it is very necessary and maybe not as much work as maybe some of you fear. It was really interesting for the subcommittee that sort of led to this series. We sent out a survey, and it was interesting to see the responses. The survey was anonymous, so people gave fairly honest answers. So a number of people said that they just didn't quite know where to go to write metadata. And those are really the people that we're trying to reach in the next two sessions, the next two parts of this metadata series. Quite a few said they don't have enough time. It's not as exciting to work on. I think one person said, I don't see the point. So hopefully by now you do see a point. There is really a point to it. It really increases the usability of your data. So I really would encourage you to at least write something, and preferably more complete metadata. And with that, I will just announce the next two talks that we have on November 12th. Keith Weber and Sydney Lewis will talk about how the metadata sausage is created. And then Pam Bond will talk on December 3rd about the metadata and spreading the love and sharing that, and just looking more on the at the online component of metadata. So with that, I guess there's a little bit of time if anybody has any questions.
That's right. There's time for some questions. If folks had questions, you can either unmute yourself and ask that question, or put your question into the chat line